The grass is green here. The sun is warm. This is the heartland of America, a place where the landscape promises normalcy and tradition. We are in rural Arkansas. Quiet, agricultural, unremarkable dot. But if you stand here, right now, and listen closely to the wind carrying the scent of pine and rich soil, you hear nothing unusual. Yet this land holds a secret. A deep radiological scar buried beneath the topsoil, sealed by decades of willful silence. For years, local residents complained of strange, persistent illnesses, unexplained tremors, water that tasted metallic, sometimes almost wrong. These complaints were dismissed, attributed to industrial runoff, to rural paranoia. They were wrong. Decades ago, the U.S. government built a facility here. It was a response to the deepest fear of the Cold War, a place of absolute secrecy and absolute power. It was called Site K1207. This is not the story of Chernobyl, where the catastrophe announced itself in fire and smoke. This is the story of a disaster engineered by urgency and hidden by bureaucracy. A disaster that never truly made the headlines because it was never allowed to. What happens when the biggest threat to a nation is not an enemy missile, but the radioactive waste of its own fear, buried right beneath its feet? Officially, Site K1207 was an ancillary defense installation. Sometimes it was categorized as a high-security storage depot. Sometimes a military communications hub. Always generic. Always boring. Always classified. The gates told a different story. They were steel cages, topped with razor wire, guarded by heavily armed military police who carried M16s and never made eye contact. The perimeter fences were double-layered, patrolled by dogs trained for silent aggression. Locals near the facility, if they talked about it at all, called it simply the arsenal. But K1207 was far more than an arsenal. It was part of the United States' decentralized nuclear core, a vital, deeply buried node in the national defense infrastructure designed to withstand a direct Soviet attack. Its true function was complex, terrifying, and completely unknown to the public. It housed and managed crucial fissile materials, performing final assembly and maintenance on the cores of strategic nuclear weapons. This level of secrecy was deemed essential. If K1207 was struck, the entire U.S. chain of command required a facility that could rapidly process, repair, and deploy nuclear components as a second strike capability. Urgency was the defining principle. Safety, containment, and public disclosure were secondary or non-existent. The mission was survival. The cost was irrelevant. The official narrative was a smokescreen. The reality was a ticking time bomb, placed deliberately in the quiet heart of America. The decision to build K1207 stemmed directly from the massive fear generated by the Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 and the rapid escalation of the ICBM arms race. The Pentagon realized that large, centralized weapons facilities like those in Tennessee or Washington state were too tempting a target. A single, successful Soviet strike could cripple America's nuclear deterrent. The solution was to scatter the most sensitive components, the plutonium pits and enriched uranium cores, across smaller, more remote, and deeply buried facilities across the country. K1207, hidden deep in the Arkansas countryside, was one such critical node. Construction began in the late 1950s, a frantic, high-priority operation overseen by the Army Corps of Engineers and the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC. The environment was brutal. Workers were often pushed to 16-hour shifts. The rock and soil composition were difficult, complicating the subterranean construction. But the deadlines were absolute. Every week lost was a week vulnerable too. Soviet attack. Internal memos from the AEC at the time reveal the mindset. The risk of structural failure or environmental breach is acceptable, given the overriding necessity of operational readiness. The very foundation of Site K-1207 was built on a calculus that valued speed over human safety. The builders were digging a deep hole, not just in the ground, but in the nation's ethical ledger. Site K-1207 was a subterranean labyrinth. Access was gained via massive concrete blast doors hidden behind an innocuous-looking warehouse. Inside, the air was dense, filtered, and perpetually cold, regardless of the heat outside. The facility was designed with triple redundancy. Steel-reinforced tunnels descended several hundred feet, leading to the core operational zones. At the heart of K-1207 was the Plutonium Processing and Assembly Chamber, PPAC. This was where technicians, working inside heavily shielded glove boxes, handled the fissile cores. The PPAC was kept under continuous negative pressure, an attempt to contain any accidental release within the chamber itself. The sensory details were overwhelming. There was the constant, high-pitched whine of the powerful air filtration systems, the thick, acrid smell of ozone and hydraulic oil, the oppressive stillness outside the work chambers, broken only by the rhythmic clack-clack of security patrols. The workers were ghosts in this manufactured environment. They lived entirely by the electric clock and artificial light. Their routines were monotonous, obsessive, and centered around protocols that treated the slightest misstep as potentially fatal. Isolation was complete. When a man left the facility for his mandatory rotation, he often felt physically ill from the sudden, jarring contact with sunlight, open space, and the sounds of ordinary life. He carried the burden of the silence and the secrets back into his family life, unable to share the crushing, metallic fear he experienced daily. The men and women who worked at K-1207 were not soldiers. They were highly skilled, working-class Americans welders, pipe fitters, engineers, and chemists, drawn by the high pay and patriotic duty. But the psychological toll was immense. They knew what they handled. They understood the destructive potential of the plutonium cores better than anyone. Pressure came from two directions: the constant threat of the Soviet Union demanding perfect work, and the pervasive surveillance from their own superiors. Error was not an option. They told us that if we saw anything wrong, anything at all, we had to report it immediately. But they also made it clear that reporting anything that shut down production meant ruin. Not just for us, but for the nation. Quote reconstructed from an interview with a former security guard. Late 1990s. The moral conflict was a slow internal corrosion. Workers often complained of persistent, low-level fevers and exhaustion, which doctors who were themselves vetted and controlled by the AEC attributed to stress or cold exposure. The AEC established a culture of absolute obedience. Anyone caught questioning safety protocols, or worse, discussing the facility with outsiders, was immediately dismissed, their security clearance revoked, and their career destroyed. The silence was enforced not by chains, but by economic terror that they were ordinary Americans performing an impossible, world-ending task, and their loyalty was brutally exploited. The official records are fragmented, contradictory, and heavily redacted. But investigators now believe the catastrophe occurred in the winter of 1967-1968. Immediate trigger appears to have been a containment failure in the high-pressure ventilation systems serving the PPAC during a routine core transfer. It was not an explosion or a meltdown. It was far quieter and far more insidious. The system, strained by constant use and deferred maintenance, failed to maintain negative pressure. For a brief, agonizing period, minutes, perhaps hours, plutonium dust, microscopic, invisible, and catastrophically toxic, was released, The immediate reaction was chaos, quickly suppressed by protocol. Alarms sounded briefly and were manually overridden. Supervisors, terrified of the consequences of a full shutdown and official report, ordered a rapid, contained cleanup. Personnel inside the affected zone were immediately evacuated and rushed to medical evaluation. Their medical files were instantly sealed, designated Operational Priority Delta. Crucially, the radioactive particles did not remain within the facility. They were inevitably drawn out through the complex ventilation exhaust, carried by the low-level hum of the filtration system. These particles were expelled into the dense forest air, settling silently on the nearby soil, the groundwater, and the homes of unsuspecting Arkansas residents. The contamination was not a sudden burst of fire, but a slow, invisible, irreversible poisoning of the local environment. The public saw nothing. The local newspaper reported routine maintenance at the defense facility. Behind the fences, the panic was total. The AEC and military deployed specialized crews to conduct a massive internal decontamination. The affected zones were essentially entombed within the structure itself. Sealed off with concrete and steel, the medical records of the exposed workers were shipped to Washington, D.C., never to be seen again. The workers were simply told their health was fine, then transferred or quietly retired on medical grounds under strict non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, that threatened federal prosecution for any breach of secrecy. The lie held. K-1207 continued to operate, but at a reduced capacity, haunted by the invisible residue of its own failure. The long-term consequences, however, could not be contained by an NDA. Over the next 2 decades, local physicians noted a disproportionate number of rare cancers and unexplained birth defects in the surrounding rural communities. These clusters were consistently dismissed by state and federal health agencies as statistically insignificant. The danger was slow, delayed, and therefore deniable. The cover-up worked because the fallout was silent. Decades later, fragments of the truth began to emerge. Environmental journalists and academic historians, piecing together fragments of AEC operational histories and the scattered testimonies of dying former workers, began to uncover the pattern. They found incomplete records of unusual soil remediation done miles from the official perimeter. They found the sealed medical logs confirming the transfer of personnel after an unreported incident. Today, Site K-1207 is mothballed. The facility is officially closed, heavily monitored, and still inaccessible. But the ice has melted, and the secrets are thawing. The danger never went away. The contamination is still there, carried in the groundwater, in the soil, slowly migrating. This is the unsettling legacy of the Cold War. The most dangerous nuclear disasters are not the ones we remember, but the ones we were never allowed to know about. The quiet land of Arkansas holds the silent, radioactive memory of America's fear.